Hello and welcome to Straight Talk, Supply Chain Insights, the podcast for your supply chain leader who is on the go and wants to be in the know. And now, your host, Laura Ciceri.
Welcome to the Supply Chain Insights Global Summit. I am proud to kick off the digital showcase where I interview supply chain leaders and technologists to understand their vision of Supply Chain 2030. And today I'm interviewing Allan Dow from Logility. And Allan, we've probably known each other 2 decades now. We both have a little gray hair, right?
That's right.
Allan, tell the group a little bit about yourself.
Very good. Thank you, Laura. Yeah, at least 2 decades, but yes, thank you very much. I've been here at Logility for that time period when I first met Laura back in those days, various roles, but really passionate about supply chain and all the impacts we can have on the world and love the successes from our clients. I've have the luxury of being able to engage and learn a lot about supply chain. I have a background in chemical engineering where I got my degree, but my passion here is in the supply chain space. So thank you for inviting me, Laura. I love to engage in these kind of dialogues.
Well, we're both geeky chemical engineers, right? And Logility is one of the oldest software providers in the planning space that I follow. You have your roots and, your parent company, and tell the group a little bit about Logility.
Yes, thank you. For sure, you're right. Goes all the way back to a PhD thesis at Georgia Tech, which we're headquartered here in Atlanta. Georgia Tech is right downtown. Laura, I think you do some work with them as well. Great supply chain practice there. But it was all about using computing capabilities to plan future forecasts and then manage your supply chain through those plans. So that's pretty exciting. Over the years, we've continued to grow and evolve and adopt technology. We've grown through both organically and through acquisitions. And today, really, our central focus is around supply chain planning, part of the supply chain practices. But we also reach and dabble a little bit on the execution side to go back into the supply chain around sourcing products and making sure we get good deliveries. It's exciting practice. Our focus is primarily our clients are in the consumer goods space.
So, Allan, Supply Chain 2030 sounds like it's pretty far off, but when I started Supply Chain Insights, we had a similar conversation about 2020, and wow, 2020, we could never have imagined 2020, right? If you look at the experience over the last decade and what's happened, pandemic, post-pandemic, and now what's happening and, inflation and perhaps double-dip recession, how do you think people prepare for 2030, kind of that next generation of talents?
That's a great question. As I think about that, Laura, there's probably 3 things that come to mind. Let me highlight the 3, and then I'll dive a little bit into each one of those. First of all, I think by 2030, our supply chains will be far more global. It's going to be a fun one to come back to because people may say, what do you mean more global? The globe is as big as it is. We will be far more regulated. And I also believe we will be far more transparent. So let's go back to the first one. What do I mean by more global? Today, you certainly have global enterprises that sell their products around the world. Maybe they're tailored a little bit to the markets. But for the most part, many of the products are sourced regionally. So for instance, a lot of the apparel comes out of Asia, but yet it gets sold around the world. I believe, and one of the things we learned out of the pandemic is that in the end, in order to be more agile, to be more resilient, to be more responsive, all things that folks that are deep in the supply chains are thinking about, we're going to have to be more regional in our sourcing. Not 100%. Not everything in the U.S. that's purchased in the U.S. will be sourced and produced in the U.S., but there will be an element of that. So when I say more global, it's really a multi-enterprise, multi-regional sourcing and multi-regional sales channels. So that's going to make supply chains a little more complex. More regulated, I think there's no question about that. The enlightenment that we've had during the pandemic, the fact that new regulations are coming on, like the U.S. import rules, the New York Fashion Act, even in Europe with the German Supply Chain Act, all of those are just the tip of the iceberg, I believe, relative to making sure that supply chains operate in good stead. And then when I say more transparent, I absolutely believe that the technology is going to allow us to get to the point where we as consumers could walk into a retail environment, pick up a product, scan a barcode or whatever the capability is at that point, and look at the heritage of that particular item, not what the supply chain should do, but where the path that supply chain went through. And that'll be enabled through technology. Through that, I think all of a sudden the regulations become less important because the consumers will drive that transparency and make sure that supply chains operate in a good way, in a sustainable way. So those are the three thoughts I have, kind of big ideas. Laura, if as those come true, supply chains are going to be far more complex than they are today. And when you think about that, you say, wow, that's a big task, because today they're far more complex than they were 5 years ago, certainly 20 years ago when you and I first started working together.
Well, and I think that we've let complexity basically happen unabated. But, you've been doing work on fair labor, actually, some thought leading work on fair labor. What have you learned from that work around improving transparency of the multi-tier supply chain?
Very ambitious work that's going on. And I think we got a little bit out as an organization, as an industry, we got a little bit out over our skis with our passion there, but the technology is quickly catching up. You're right. We worked closely with the U.S. Customs Organization about what the vision should be and what the practical side of that should be. We've deployed that with a number of clients now, and we're actually in practice with those folks. But it's hard because people don't even understand the full depth of their supply chain today. So as we dive into it, what we start to learn is there are tentacles in the supply chain that reach into areas that they had no idea. So it's been inspirational. It's enlightening as they go in there. But the other thing that I've learned is, just like I believe with most humans, people want to do the right things. It's just hard to do the right things all the time because you don't even know what the right thing is in some cases. So a lot to learn and a lot of technology development to happen to enable what we really want to accomplish.
Well, and sometimes people learn kind of ugly things, right? That, and I know you're out over your skis, but I love to see you out over your skis. And I would encourage people that want to know more about transparency and eco-labeling to talk to you about, how they can get out over their skis, because there aren't good solutions, right? When people talk to me about corporate social responsibility, 92% of companies have some kind of pretty document, but most people are focused on enterprise decisions versus really embracing the network. So, I applaud you for some of that work. So how do you think we basically build this next generation of teams? Because I know you've got a daughter in school and, you also do recruiting. And, as I look at the number of baby boomers that have retired, most of the people that I grew up with through supply chain have retired, and many people would say I probably should retire. But how do we basically train that next generation supply chain talent? Any insights?
I think the thing that we start with is, what does an inspired workforce look like, and what are the expectations of that workforce? We have to start there, Laura, really, and think into the future, 5 years, 10 years from now, what is the organization going to be like? And as you said, we're starting to see the front end of the wave of the people that have grown up in supply chain or near the end of their careers. They're going to start waving out and probably go faster and faster. So one of the things we have to do is learn from all that expertise and experience that was on the table, capture it and automate those processes, because the workforce of the future doesn't want to do what we grew up doing. The workforce of the future doesn't really get excited about diving into the data details and geeking out on it like you and I did, Laura. They really want to have operational practices that impact the supply chain, have a difference in the world. And the idea of manipulating data inside of a spreadsheet doesn't really accomplish that by itself in the short term. So we have to think differently. We have to automate some practices. We have to make work enlightening, and we're going to have far fewer people in the industry. There aren't enough people today. I don't see that catching up. So we've got to learn how to automate the practices and move the really important things that need human intervention to the front of the table, allow them to engage in that process and go. So new skills will have to come about that. It's more about analytical thinking and analytical practices, a lot about the supply chain and the consumers, the end result of the product. Where does it go and what do people want? How do we serve on that? And then some of the things we're talking about, transparency and whatnot, to think differently about how that all comes together. Supply chain organizations are going to work far less compartmentalized. They're going to be seamlessly working across the entire supply chain together. So collaboration is a big deal as well. So it's a whole different set of skills than we've thought about in the past. It's not about math and science and whatnot. We have to take care of that. It's critically important to run supply chains efficiently, but we got to put that behind the scenes, automate that, use artificial intelligence, machine learning capabilities, and those other things to deal with that, and then really enable the people to have the impact that they need, the human capital resources to impact in an analytical thinking way.
Well, it's funny. A lot of times people will answer this thinking about how the role of the planner will change. But one of the things that I've been thinking hard about is the role of the business leader and democratization of planning and how to be a good business leader with more insights out of machine learning and artificial intelligence. Because unfortunately, in the last decade, we've had greater issues with alignment. Few people are clear on the role of the forecast, the role of the budget. We get a lot of gaming of the system and overrides of, decision support tools like yours based upon bonus incentives. And so one of the things I'm studying is kind of the courageous leader that needs to kind of arise in this 2030 talent to be able to lead the supply chain, because I think that we're guilty that one of the biggest issues in managing the supply chain is the understanding by the executive team.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's changing the thinking about the way supply chains operate, Laura. I agree with you wholeheartedly there. You really start with what is the mission? What is the brand promise of the organization? What's their commitment to the marketplace around their products? And then how do we build a supply chain to support that? And every company has a different brand mission out there. So you need to think about that and then align the supply chain to support that. And then align the organizational practices and the incentives to take away the need for gaming the system, as you say, and shoving it in a direction that's not aligned with the corporate brand promise out there. So it's a rethink, Laura, and I think it's a top-down rethink, not a bottom-up rethink. And then
I totally agree.
Yeah, and then link it all the way from the bottom to the top. Then you got to go back to the individuals that are inside the supply chain and operating on a day-to-day basis, and how do you link their work, their incentives, their motivations, the communications we do with them, all the way to the top on what the corporate mission is. And when you link those together, everyone will get in sync.
Well, Allan, thank you so much for joining us in support of Supply Chain Insights. It's always good to see, Logility at the conference. And if people have questions around the work that you're doing on machine learning, artificial intelligence, the redefinition of planning and improving transparency, I'd encourage people to give Logility a call. Thanks, Allan. Have a great day.
Thanks, Laura. Bye-bye.